Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off with the inspector and Mr Birling. We're going to talk a little bit about how they interact with each other. Okay, so as soon as the inspector comes in, Mr Birling starts to, and if you look at page 11, Mr Birling starts to express his dominance over the inspector, and that's really important. So I want you to hold on to that idea of dominance. Okay, and this is where you'll be making notes. So, the inspector starts to, he comes in, he sits down, and Mr Birling starts to change, and he starts to become quite arrogant here. So you'll see he offers him port and whiskey. He's very informal with him. So again, it's Mr Birling thinking he's very untouchable here. Most people, when a police inspector would come to see them, they would be a little bit suspicious, a little bit worried perhaps. But Mr Birling seems to have this intense sense of confidence. So he then goes on just in the middle of the page to start talking about actually how he was Lord Mayor, and he starts to again assert his dominance, drop in his roles, and make himself seem like the more powerful one out of the two. He then points out that the inspector is new, so it's another attempt to undermine the inspector. So these are the sorts of things where you pause the video and you write them down. So we've got more attempts to undermine the inspector, to make the inspector seem like he isn't as important as Mr Birling. So he then talks about how he actually thinks that the inspector's come to see him because he needs his help, which is really, really interesting. Again, this idea of arrogance, and he's untouchable here. I'd like some information, if you don't mind. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant, but burnt her insides out, of course. Now you've got that gruesome imagery there. These are notes you should be making. You've got the gruesome imagery of it burning her insides out. He then says she was in great agony. So again, the inspector's using this very shocking language. And look at the person who seems to feel the most shocked by that. That's Eric. Mr Birling very much contrasts Eric's reaction here. Write all this down. Yes, horrid business, but I don't understand why you should come here, Inspector. Now, the repetition of yes is very dismissive. Yes, horrid business. And the fact that he calls it horrid, it's an adjective that really doesn't express the difficulty that he has had. So it's a bit of a difficult adjective to just to sort of use in terms of someone dying so horribly. You know, he doesn't have the same shock that Eric has. Then the inspector starts to question Mr Birling. Now, if you read through pages 12 to 13 yourself, you will know what I'm talking about here. So if you need to pause the video, please pause the video if you haven't already read pages 12 to 13. You'll notice that on page 13, Birling actually sort of tries to justify what he's done to Eva. So, yes, she was one of my employees and then I discharged her. He's playing down the situation quite a lot, isn't he? But Eric here again is contrasting his father. Is that why she committed suicide? When was this, father? So almost Eric is linking his father to the suicide of Eva. And Birling dismisses him again. Just keep quiet, Eric, and don't get excited. It's quite, again, Eric is blaming his father in a way. That's the first thing that Eric does. He goes straight to blaming his father, which is really, really interesting, considering we've already seen that they have a bit of a strained relationship where he dismisses Eric quite a lot. We don't really blame Eric. Perhaps if that's the only impression he has of his father, that his father's not a very nice person, maybe that's why he's done it. Then Birling actually says that he doesn't mind Gerald being here, and he name drops Gerald's parents, Sir George Croft. Crofts Limited. So again, Mr Birling trying to assert his status over the inspector. That's really interesting, isn't it? And when Birling then talks again, he says things somewhat impatiently. The stage directions are really important here. At the bottom, look, there's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business, at least not so far as I'm concerned. It's a perfectly straightforward case. And as it happens, more than 18 months ago, nearly 2 years ago, obviously it has nothing whatever to do with this wretched girl's suicide. So again, he's very insensitive, isn't he? And the fact that he's impatient, so that adverb impatiently is really showing us that actually Birling has no time for people that aren't him or his family or his business. Despite the fact that the inspector actually came in with quite a shocking statement, first of all, that this girl has committed suicide, she killed herself. So it's really, really shocking there as well. Now, on page 14, you'll notice that I've switched. This is perhaps one of the most important quotations for this play that you should remember, and you will remember all the way up to year 11. It's very, very important. Because Mr Birling says, I had nothing to do with this girl's suicide. And the inspector points out that what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards, and what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide, a chain of events. Now, the reason that's important, this idea of a chain of events, for several reasons, is that when we think of a chain, we think of everything linking together. So, sorry, wrong book. We think of everything linking together. So when you think of a chain of events, you start to think of links in a chain. Now, there are many links in a chain. But the whole point is, they all link together and they're all complete. So if I pulled this chain, it wouldn't break, because every single one of these has linked together. Now, what the inspector is saying here is, and this is a metaphor for collective responsibility. So the metaphor here is the chain of events. Every single person has certain actions, and those actions influence what happens next. Okay, so we then find out after this, hopefully you've read ahead, we then find out that actually Sheila then got Eva sacked. So Mr Birling is the first link in the chain. He sacks Eva. Sheila is the next link in the chain. She gets Eva sacked because she's jealous. So Eva's gone from one job to another job, and she's thinking, she's really just trying to get by, isn't she? Remember, as a member of the working class, she's trying to get by. She's trying to keep her life together. She's trying to keep herself afloat financially. Now, the chain of events basically means that at any point, if someone chose to be nice to Eva, if someone chose to give her the benefit of the doubt, it wouldn't have led to her suicide, because that's the last link in the chain. The thing that actually finally ends the chain. She doesn't want people to keep going and to keep hurting her. She doesn't want that. She wants it all to be over, which is the saddest thing about Eva Smith's death, because she thinks that if she keeps going with life, the chain of horrible events will continue. She can't see any hope anymore, and that's because people like Mr Birling and Sheila Birling took it away from her. And you'll notice there are other links in the chain too, before she kills herself. But this is really important here, because if I was Mr Birling and I chose just to give her a decent wage, I would have broken the chain. And without my link in the chain, the rest of the chain can't continue. If my link is broken, the chain is broken. Now, if Mr Birling doesn't decide to do that, but Sheila does, then even though Mr Birling's link has happened, the rest of the chain can't continue because Sheila's link was broken. So the whole point here is really showing us that your actions connect. Yeah? So what you do affects other people and affects what happens to other people. So another example is, just because someone did something horrible first, that doesn't mean that you can continue it, that you can be horrible yourself. So, for example, if a friend of yours breaks the rules at school and you then break the rules, then the chain just continues until everyone's breaking the rules and someone gets hurt. If you want to change in the world, you can't just say, oh, well, everyone else has been horrible, so I may as well be horrible. It's not how it works, is it? So the chain of events is really important, and that is probably the most important metaphor in the entire book, in my opinion. And I think it's something that you could use in any essay question that comes up. So the inspector does call it a chain of events. And Mr Birling then says, oh, well, put like that, there's something in what you say. Still, I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? Again, Mr Birling's pushing away his responsibility. And that's where he says he understands the chain, but he hasn't understood the chain of events. Your actions have consequences for people. You know, you might say one hurtful thing and think, oh, it was only one hurtful thing. But actually, the hurtful thing that you've said has been heard by someone else and heard by someone else. And then someone else might say it to the person. Oh, well, I heard you with this. Or it's a rumour. And again, it's showing that Mr Birling doesn't actually understand what it means to be responsible for your actions. And sometimes we have to take the blame for what we've done, and we have to change, and we have to be better people. But Mr Birling doesn't understand that. And he's not allowing himself to become a better person. And then Birling says, we'd all be in an impossible position, wouldn't we? Eric then says, by Jove, yes. And as you were saying, Dad, a man has to look after himself. Birling, yes, well, we needn't go into all that. Look at how Mr Birling then starts backing down from his words. And that's, again, to protect his reputation, because he doesn't want to be seen in front of a police inspector to be someone who actually doesn't care about other people. Because remember, his entire career as Lord Mayor and an alderman and everything like that, it's all about Mr Birling being seen as a really good public man and being seen as a good person. Not that he is a good person, he just likes to be seen that way. So he's a very deceptive character. So he's lying to us. So then the inspector actually asks, you know, what were you talking about? And Mr Birling says, oh, just before you came in, I'd been giving these young men a little good advice. Look how he uses that adjective, good. He thinks it's good advice. But that's subjective, isn't it? That's an opinion. But Mr Birling's so sure of himself that he says, no, I give really good advice. Now, about this girl, Eva Smith, I remember her quite well now. She was a lively, good-looking girl, country-bred, I fancy, and she'd been working in one of our machine shops for over a year, a good worker too. So he acknowledges that she was a nice girl. She was a good worker. In fact, the foreman there told me he was ready to promote her into what we call a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. But after they came back from their holidays that August, they were all rather restless, and they suddenly decided to ask for more money. They were averaging about 22 and 6, which was neither more nor less than is generally paid in our industry. They wanted the rates raised so they could average about 25 shillings a week. I refused, of course. Why? Surprised. Did you say why? So again, Mr Birling's not ready for people to call into question his actions. He sees himself as above others and doesn't think his actions should be called into question. Look at how he says, of course. So he seems to think that he's always right again. So we're getting this idea that he's always right. But the inspector is not there to make him feel like he is right. The inspector is there to question him. So you see the power shift here. The inspector becomes the more powerful one, but Mr Birling thinks he's the more powerful one. So there's a bit of an issue there. And actually, we then find out, and if you read page 15, if you need to pause this and read page 15 as well, Mr Birling actually sacks her because she asked for higher wages, because she needed to live. And remember, in 1912, there were a lot of things that people had to pay for, and they had very little help to pay for it. They didn't have an NHS or benefits or council houses. It was very difficult for them. So actually, it's really important that we start to look at Mr Birling as a person. He said she was a good worker. He said that a person in charge of that floor was going to promote her, but he sacks her anyway because he's not willing to part with his money. So she was a very, very good worker, and he sacked her anyway. So that's really interesting, isn't it? We'll look a little bit more about why that statement becomes really important when we look at Sheila as well. So we'll look at Sheila and when she gets Eva sacked from the job. I would tell you that probably the best thing to do is to read up to where we find out what Sheila has done. And before we find out about Gerald, you can read all the way up to Act 2 if you want, which is page 26. But if you want to just read up to page 24, that's fine, and that will help you for the next video.